This is really where we left off last Sunday. Moses meets God. If you can remember this angel of the Lord, this perhaps picture of Jesus appearing in the story before he is born. I love thinking about those cool, mysterious things. But he meets God, and God speaks to him in the bush. So what really is God going to say to Moses? We're going to sum up more scripture with just a few verses here and there as we walk through the story. But what does God say to Moses? Exodus chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel, God says, has come to me. I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. God doesn't just appear to Moses to say, hey, I'm God, you should worship me, here's who I am. Yes, that takes place, but God has an assignment for Moses. He has an assignment where he's going to send him to do something, and this is no easy task. God says, Moses, I'm going to send you back to the land of Egypt. I want you to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and I want you to tell him to let my people go. Now, Moses had all sorts of excuses to give. We'll touch on a few of those. He had all sorts of reasons why this may not work. God, how is Pharaoh going to take this? What if Pharaoh says no? Like, you think of all the things that you might consider. Are you sure you want to send me? I grew up there and then I left kind of on bad terms. I don't know if I'm the best candidate to go back. I don't even speak well. I have a stutter. God, there's probably a lot more people that could do a better job than me. And maybe we can all identify with Moses in this regard. But God sends him nonetheless. So what if Pharaoh says no? Right? God actually has a plan for this. Let's jump down a little bit further. Verse 19 and 20 of the same chapter. God says, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt, and with all the wonders that I will do in it, after that he will let you go. So God is not surprised. God knows that Pharaoh is going to say no. He will reject this offer. He will reject this suggestion from this foreign God, this God Yahweh that is the God of this guy Moses, who's come in from the land of Midian, who has a bad history as he left Egypt 40 years ago. But God says, I will strike Egypt with all my wonders in order to convince them. And after I have done said wonders, then and only then will Pharaoh let your people go. And so let's catch up, move forward in the story. Moses, again, reluctantly, you may say, agrees to God's assignment. He goes back to the land of Egypt. He meets up with his brother Aaron. Aaron's about 3 years older. And Aaron, God says, well, hey, Aaron can be your mouthpiece. Aaron can talk well where maybe you're not able to talk quite as well. So God will tell something to Moses. Moses will pass it along to Aaron. And then Aaron will be the primary speaker. So Aaron and Moses, right, these two brothers, go into Egypt. They confront Pharaoh and they say, Pharaoh, let our people go. I can't help but think of that without the Charlton Heston voice from the old movie, the Ten Commandments movie. Anybody seen the old Ten Commandments? The great graphics, high quality CGI. Also, Prince of Egypt. There's my weekly Prince of Egypt plug. Make sure you watch Prince of Egypt. Let my people go. Now, Pharaoh doesn't just say no. He does say no, but it's actually worse, right? As a young man, sometimes young men get together and they say, oh, go over and ask that girl out on a date. The worst she can say is no. Well, things go worse than just no. They ask Pharaoh to let our people go, and he says, I'm going to raise up the burdens of the people. I'm going to make it harder on the current slaves, the Hebrews that are here. What they had to do is they had to get the straw and the mud, and they would mix it together. They'd burn them. They'd make bricks. This is the primary task that they would do. Normally, the straw was provided for them. Now, Pharaoh says they've got to go get their own straw. So he's doubled, you could say, their labor, and they still have to get all the things done. And so the burden, the oppression on their backs has gotten worse because of now what Moses has done. So it wasn't just that he said no, he made things worse. And as you can imagine, the people are grumbling. I would be grumbling. All of us would likely be grumbling. Moses, what are you doing? Just shut your mouth. Don't cause us any more trouble. And so God would tell Moses what to tell the people. So we've worked our way from chapter 3 into 4 into 5 into 6. Now we're into chapter 6. He's back in Egypt. This is what God tells Moses to tell the people. Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them. And I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. That's a mighty response from God. Hopefully you heard all of the times it was listed in there where it says, I will. God speaks, I will do it. I will rescue you. I will redeem you. I will come through in my promises. I will strike Egypt with a mighty hand. I will bring about judgment upon the land of Egypt. I will do this, God says. And Moses reassures the people, hey, I know that I'm nothing special. I'm not going to be able to do it. Aaron and I aren't going to be able to convince Pharaoh, but God will. Can we believe him? God will do it. And it says that he will do it through acts of divine judgment. All right? Judgment, that's everyone's favorite biblical word, right? All us modern Christians. Judgment. God says, I will bring about acts of judgment upon the land of Egypt. Today we're going to be talking about God's power. The mighty power of God. Now, this power is brought up in this verse with these acts of judgment, and what we know of what comes next are all of the plagues that would hit the land of Egypt. These acts of divine judgment that hit God striking the land of Egypt, these are the 10 plagues that come next. Now, we're not going to read all of these plagues. This takes us from chapter 7 all the way into chapter 12. Moses would go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Pharaoh would say no, and then the first plague would hit. Then Moses would return and say, okay, how about now? Will you let our people go? And Pharaoh would say no. Then the second plague. This would repeat for 10 plagues. Now, you may be familiar with some of these plagues, maybe all of these plagues. What I'd like to do is just briefly run through these 10 plagues. All right, are we ready? Here's the top 10. The first plague, number 1, and I don't have this on the screen because the sermon today isn't about memorizing the 10 plagues, so just listen as we go along. Number 1, turning the Nile into blood. The mighty Nile River, the source of life for much of the land of Egypt, is turned into blood. Number 2, an infestation of frogs. Have you ever stepped on a frog barefoot? I know someone who has. That's why I said that. Dust. Number 3, dust is turned into gnats or lice. Gnats or lice. Have you ever had lice? Let's just keep going. Have you ever had lice? You don't have to raise your hand. Do you have it now? If you do now, please leave or go to the back. Number 4, swarms of flies. All of the picnics in Egypt are ruined. Swarms of flies. Number 5, deadly diseases strike the livestock. Many of the livestock are killed. Number 6, sores and boils on people and on animals. Sores and boils, these skin disease, these infectious skin diseases appear on people and on the animals. Number 7, a severe hailstorm. All right, we get some of those in Colorado in the summertime when it looks like it snowed a little bit, but it's just covered in hail. A severe hailstorm strikes the land of Egypt. Number 8, swarms of locusts that devour all of the crops. Swarms of locusts, these giant grasshopper-looking creatures that come in and eat up all of the crops. Number 9, darkness that would last for 3 days. Darkness in the land, the sun blotted out for 3 days. And then number 10, the last one, is the death of all of the firstborn sons. The death of the firstborn sons. So have you ever wondered why these 10 plagues? Why these? Why did God act in this way? What is God trying to communicate? Are these random? Is God just thinking up things? Why these 10 plagues? Do they have any significance? We're going to talk about that. Before we do, I want us to be reminded of something we talk about often here, and that there is a very real physical and spiritual world. There's a very real physical world that we see and interact with, and there's also a very real spiritual world that is not less than, in fact, the Apostle Paul would say it's even more real, as the physical world is fading away and the spiritual world is constantly becoming more and more permanent. These are both true. We are humanity. We are spiritual and physical beings combined. When God creates us, He takes the dust of the earth and then the breath of life, His own breath, and puts them together, and here we are, created humanity. We are physical and spiritual, and the earth, the world, the universe, the heavens and the earth that God has created is both physical and spiritual. And for us in modern times today, we oftentimes look over and forget about the spiritual and the things that are spiritual. They're all throughout the Scriptures, by the way. Sometimes they're very obvious, right? The Apostle Paul would say in Ephesians 6, hey, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. He comes right out and says it. Other times it's more subtle, and we have to look closely to catch it. God is the God of both the physical and the spiritual. Of course He is. God is the God of both the physical and the spiritual. And with the spiritual come spiritual beings. Some of you are getting nervous talking about spiritual beings. With the spiritual come spiritual beings, angels and demons, these other gods, as we're going to see in a moment. All underneath, of course, Yahweh, God, the Creator. But there are other spiritual beings, and God is God of all of this. God is God of all of the physical and the spiritual beings. In Psalm 97, let me read one verse to you. There's several places you can find little glimpses of this. I just want to read one verse. Psalm chapter 97, verse 9 says, "For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. For you, O Lord, are exalted above all the earth. You, O Lord, are above all the gods." That word there for Lord, whenever you see Lord in all caps in your Old Testament, that's the name Yahweh. That's God's name, who He gives that name to Moses in the story. I am that I am, Yahweh. Oh Lord, Yahweh is high above all the earth. He is above all the other gods. The word there for gods is the word Elohim. Some of you have heard that word Elohim before. In fact, the most famous place we find the word Elohim is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, Elohim, God, created the heavens and the earth. There are times when Elohim is translated gods, lowercase g. There are times when Elohim is translated God, capital G. And it takes a lot of work and understanding and reading and preparation and context to understand these things. What we know to be true is that God, Yahweh, is over all of the Elohim gods. And yet God, this powerful, mighty God, Yahweh, that we serve, His people are slaves. They're second-class citizens. They're on the bottom of society. They're nothing special. They're nothing famous. In fact, they're enslaved by another kingdom, a rival kingdom to the kingdom of God that is upon the earth in the land of Egypt. And so God is going to respond to Egypt by showing His dominance over the gods of Egypt. So maybe your question is, well, are these gods of Egypt real or are they fake? Are these gods of Egypt real or are they made up? And this is a wonderful question, by the way. The truth is, the answer is both. The gods of Egypt are made up in the sense of what their names are and what they mean and the things they're in charge of and the folklore and legend and tales and the backstories and all that they've come up with over time. All that is made up, man-made. But the truth is, there are spiritual beings, some of which who have fallen out of the good graces of God, that animate the empires, the dark forces of the world. The Apostle Paul would later say the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. There are these gods that animate, that give life to, that lead the Egypts and the Babylons, the Assyrians and the Romes. Like I said, there's a very real physical and spiritual presence, and God is in charge of all of them, and He is about to show His dominance over the gods of Egypt. So let's walk back through these 10 really quickly. The first plague is turning the Nile to blood. And I'm going to do my best to pronounce all these names right. Just bear with me. We're going to look at a few Egyptian gods and goddesses. Hapi is the god of the Nile. Khnum is the source of the Nile. And Osiris is said to be the bloodstream of the Nile. So who is in charge of the Nile? Yahweh. Not Hapi, not Khnum, not Osiris. Heket is the goddess of fertility. And she has, as she is depicted, the head of a frog. So what does God do for the second plague? Infestation of frogs. Who is in charge of the frogs? Is it Heket? It is Yahweh. Number 3, Geb. Geb is the earth god. And Khepri is the god of insects. Geb, the earth god, and Khepri, the god of the insects. Yahweh takes all of the dust of the earth and He turns it into lice, into gnats. Who's in charge of the earth, of the dust? Is it Heket? Or excuse me, is it Geb? No, it is Yahweh. Wachit. That's my favorite of the names. Wachit is the god of the marshes associated with flies. The Nile River runs through there, and there's all these marshlands, which if you've ever lived near a marshland, you know there's a lot of insects around, and the flies. Wachit is the god of marshes, and so God in the fourth plague sends a swarm of flies. Wachit is not in charge of the flies, it is Yahweh. Number 5, Hathor. By the way, this is cool to me. If this isn't cool to you, just take a moment. This is cool. Hathor is the goddess of many things, but is depicted with the head of a cow. And then Apis is a sacred bull god of the Egyptians. So what is the fifth plague? Deadly diseases strike all of the livestock. Who is in charge of all of the livestock? It is Yahweh. Number 6, Sekhmet and Imhotep. Some of these names you may have heard of before. These are gods associated with healing and disease. So God, at the next command, strikes the land with sores and boils. Who is in charge of the health of the people and of the animals? Is it Sekhmet and Imhotep? No, it is Yahweh, showing His dominance and authority. Nut, number 7, Nut is the goddess of the sky, and Seth, the god of storms. So what does God do in the seventh plague? He sends a massive hailstorm. Who is in charge of the heavens and the sky and the storms? It is Yahweh. Later we will see Jesus calm the storm Himself. Number 8, Osiris. Among other things, you may have heard of Osiris. Among other things, he is the god of agriculture and of the crops. And so God sends a swarm of locusts to devour all of the crops. Who is in charge of the crops? It is Yahweh, the God of Moses. Number 9, Ra. The most powerful and most well-known god of the Egyptians is the god Ra. Ra is the sun god, in charge of the sun. Also, Isis and Horus are associated with the sun and with light. And so who is in charge of the sun? It is not Ra, it is Yahweh. And He blots out the sun for 3 days, darkness, at the name of Yahweh. The last plague. Pharaoh is considered the son of Ra, therefore the son of God. And all of the sons would be killed in the 10th plague. I believe this 10th plague is perhaps the most complicated for us. I believe that what goes along with this 10th plague and the death of the firstborn sons is also the return of their own consequences of sin upon their heads. I've talked about this before at this church, and this is important to understand. There is an intimate connection between the wrath of God and the consequences of sin. In fact, I believe that they are unified, one and the same. The wrath of God and the consequences of sin. Sometimes we want to attribute everything, especially the ancient world, to God. And this is the gods and the wrath of God, when honestly it's just the rules of the universe that God, Yahweh, has created. And there are consequences to our actions. And there's a picture of this, I believe, that comes through in a very real way with this 10th commandment. Because 2 generations earlier, when Moses was a baby, the Egyptians, under the direction of Pharaoh, killed all of the baby boys of the Hebrews. Threatened by them, and he threw the baby boys into the Nile. And now this sin of the land of Egypt has been returned upon their head in this final and 10th plague. It is a picture of the consequences of sin. And also God showing dominance over Pharaoh and all the rest of these gods. Now, this is important for us to understand. You don't have to remember all of those gods and the things they're in charge of. That's okay, but here's what I want us to consider for just a moment. God is not a maniacal killer looking up creative ways to torture people. There are times we can read the Old Testament, stories like this and others, and think, God is just a maniacal, crazy killer, thinking up of crazy ways to torture people. And if we're not careful, we can think of that as we look through these plagues. That is not what is happening. God is very specifically showing His dominance over the land of Egypt, this competing empire, and all of the gods that they worship and follow. That He is dominant over all of them and over all the earth. This is what is acting out in this story right now. God displays power over the land of Egypt and their gods without killing anyone until we get to the last plague. He tried and he tried and he tried and he tried and he tried, and finally death comes in the 10th plague. As the sins of Egypt and the sins of Pharaoh are returned upon their heads. This is acts of divine judgment, and yet at the same time divine salvation. We'll talk about the Passover next Sunday. But at the same time, this act of divine judgment is this act of divine salvation for all those who would put blood on their doorpost that would be spared and saved by God. Now, in this story, the story of the 10 plagues and other Old Testament stories, we see the power of God as it brings destruction, chaos, and death. And it can lead many people, maybe you're in this category, it can lead many people to struggle to comprehend and to understand the God of the Old Testament as we see Him depicted through the many different narrative stories. Especially as we begin to think about how He is revealed more fully and more clearly with Jesus Christ in the New Testament. I've been there before, maybe you have been there before. There are many stories of God's divine power in the Old Testament that bring about death and chaos and destruction. Just ask the Egyptians what they think of Yahweh. He's all powerful, but they're scared to death. The truth is, these occur in an unfolding story of God. A story, as we've said before, that is not finished yet until we get to Jesus. Can I get an amen? The story of who God is not fully clear until we get to Jesus. So how do we see Jesus in these acts of divine power? Remember, that is our series, Christ in the Exodus. How do we see Jesus in these divine acts of God's power? Jesus would display the power of God many times. And I'm not going to read a bunch of scriptures. I want to give you a few examples for you to consider where Jesus displays the mighty power of God. Jesus Christ has the power over death, as displayed in resurrection, both for Him and for others whom He would raise from the dead. That is a pretty significant power, the power over death, which Jesus would display. Number 2, Jesus has the power over physics. He would multiply the fish and the loaves. Jesus has the power over physics, the laws of nature. He would turn water into wine. He would walk upon the water. Jesus has the power over the physical world in every aspect. Jesus has the power over nature. He would calm the storm upon the boat. He could speak to the wind and to the waves. Jesus has power over nature itself. Jesus has the power over life and health. Jesus could bring about life. He raised people from the dead, but he could heal people, and he healed many, many, many people throughout his ministry. It was a primary thing with which started his ministry, was him known as a healer. And he would free someone from the bondage of some type of disease. The blind would see and the lame would walk. He would heal people again and again. Jesus has the power over life and health. Jesus has the power over revenge. Maybe you think, well, that's not as special as the others. But it is, actually. Jesus has the power over revenge. The cycle and pattern of the world that had led it into a period of darkness. Jesus has the power over revenge through the power of radical forgiveness. And Jesus would forgive people that had no business of being forgiven. Did not earn it, not even close. Lastly, Jesus would have the power, display the power over hate. Again, the power over hate that controlled and dominated the world, and it led to war and slavery and oppression and all of the evils. He had the power over hate through radical love, and Jesus would love those who would hate him. Something that we all are tasked to do, by the way, and yet we all fall short so often. Jesus would love the people who hated him. And so instead of recycling hate for hate that continues to grow and multiply throughout the world and cause all sorts of problems, Jesus would recycle the hate, he would swallow it, and he would return it with love. This is what Jesus calls us to do also, by the way. These displays of power from Jesus, I want us to see, they bring about life. They feel a little different, perhaps, than some of these displays of power that we've just read about or that we see in the Old Testament. They feel different, and the question is, why? Why do we see the difference between the power of God displayed through Jesus Christ and what he does, and then some of the stories that we've just read about God in the Old Testament and the plagues and the flood and the fires and all of the things that happen in the Old Testament? Why is this? In fact, why doesn't Jesus, when he comes on the scene, why doesn't Jesus just defeat and kill all of the Romans and their gods? This is Jesus' setting. For the God of the Old Testament and Moses, it was the land of Egypt and their gods. Jesus comes on the scene during the period of the Romans and their gods and goddesses. They had just as many, if not more, gods and goddesses in the land of Rome. Why don't we see Jesus act in the same way? Again, all these are wonderful questions, and they're good for us to think about and to consider. And I don't want us to be a church that says, oh, we're following Jesus, so let's just kind of throw the Old Testament out. We don't need to really look at that. That's not really helpful. That's not who we are, and that's not the importance of the Old Testament. We must wrestle and consider the truth of these stories. We don't dismiss them. But it is clear that we are following Jesus. That's what it means to be a Christian. It's a little Christ, a Christite. We are following Jesus. God would use his power in specific ways in the unfolding story of Israel. God would use his might and power in specific ways in the unfolding story of Israel. This is part of God's covenant faithfulness to this family that's grown into a nation that he promised that he would bless, that he would preserve, that he would rescue, and that he would lead all the way until they could then become a nation that blesses the world, which, by the way, is accomplished through Jesus, not through how great Israel may or may not be. It's through Jesus. So he's promised them, I will sustain you all the way until we get to Jesus. And who are we, who am I, who are you to question God as he acts within the story of the nation of Israel, as he guards them and protects them and sticks with them? And there are things that God would do within this unfolding story that were necessary as it leads to the protection and safety of Israel throughout the Old Testament. God would not give up on His people, no matter how many times they turned and ran from Him and rebuked Him and stopped worshiping Him and turned to false gods and idols. God would remain faithful to them, and He would save and preserve a remnant of Israel that would lead us all the way to Jesus. God was faithful to Israel, but God had a bigger plan also. This is why there are two parts to our Bible. There's an old covenant and there's a new covenant. God had a plan to stick with Israel and to see them and preserve them all the way until they gets to Jesus. And He's going to do what He feels is necessary to do within that story. But there's a bigger story that's actually being told that leads to God seeking to bring salvation to the whole world, to all of the cosmos, to the universe He has created, to bring about salvation not just for one nation, but for all people. This is the bigger story that God is actually telling that leads us to Jesus. Jesus comes to fully reveal God. We say this often. Jesus comes to fully reveal God and to show us the right way to display God's power and to understand God's character. Let me say that again. Jesus comes to reveal God fully, and He comes to show us the right way to display God's power and the same way to reveal God's character. I want to look at two quick examples that are going to help make this understood a little bit better. And it's how we understand God as we read the Bible. Something I've talked about here before is that the full picture of God is not finished in the book of Exodus. It's not finished in Leviticus. It's not finished with Samson. It's not finished with Joshua. It's not finished with Abraham. It's not finished with David. It's not finished with any of the prophets. It's not finished yet until we get to Jesus. Jesus comes to reveal what God is actually like where we have misunderstood or been uncertain in the past. It's why the Apostle John in chapter 1 says, "No one has ever seen God until now, Jesus, who has come to make God known." Again, these are things we've talked about before. So in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy and several other places, they get the law from God. God gives His law to the people of Israel in a specific story because they need it as they're going to live out and stand apart in the story of the Old Testament. And in the law, God would tell them, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard this verse before probably. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a cut for a cut, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound. All of these things are listed, and it was needed in the unfolding story of the people because what they were used to was that the revenge was much greater than the offense. Right? We've talked about this. Someone would kill some of my family member, one family member, and I would return by killing 50 of theirs. They would steal one of my oxen, and I would steal all of theirs. The revenge was much greater, the retaliation was much greater than the offense. This was the way and the pattern of the world. And God says, okay, that cannot be our system. That will not be our law. So we are going to make it unified, one for one. Someone kills you, they get killed. Someone steals your thing, their thing is getting stolen. It's one for one for one for one. This is what an eye and an eye and an eye and a tooth for a tooth means. That is needed and necessary in the story. But is that the end of the story? No, it's not. Jesus, quite famously, let's read it, we've heard it before. Jesus would say this in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 and 39. You have heard it said, right? The Old Testament. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, but I say, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Jesus gives us these challenging words. Hey, you have heard it said, and He's not just making up some folklore. He's referencing the Old Testament, the Bible. You've heard this before, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. If they slap you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Forgiveness will be the new pattern. So did they need in the Old Testament the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Yes, they needed it. But it wasn't the end of the story, and it wasn't the end of the character, the picture shown of God. Jesus would display that. The second example, the prophet Elijah. He's known for calling down fire from heaven. He does so with all the prophets of Baal, and he calls down the fire, and it burns up the altar there on Mount Carmel. And a short time after, 2 Kings chapter 1, a short time after, the king of Israel is sending forth an army to retrieve Elijah. They want to bring Elijah back in, and he doesn't want to go with them. And so he calls down fire from heaven again, and it burns up the 50 soldiers. And then they bring 50 more, and he calls down fire from heaven again, and it burns up 50 more. Finally, he is convinced to go with them. You can read that on your own. It's 2 Kings chapter 1, I think, verse 10. I wrote it down. Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 10 through 12. So that's in the Bible. Then we have Jesus once again. Let me read this example from Luke chapter 9, verse 51 to 56. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, that's Jesus to be crucified, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. James and John were quite familiar with the Old Testament stories of God and His power, and they said, okay, this calls for an Old Testament God. This calls for the power of God displayed through divine acts of violence and judgment. And they're familiar with the story of Elijah the prophet, and they say, Jesus, in the same way, this is what they're referencing. Jesus, in the same way, can we call down fire from heaven to burn up this Samaritan village? And how does Jesus respond? He turns and he rebukes them. In fact, I want to read to you this note that's in my scriptures. Sometimes there's notes of like, hey, this was in certain manuscripts and certain ones weren't in. Let me read this note. This is in some of the manuscripts. If I can pull it up. Some manuscripts add, and this won't be on the screen. It adds this: "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man came not to destroy people's lives, but to save them." Let me read that again. Jesus would respond to say, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man came not to destroy people's lives, but to save them." James and John, all they're doing is referencing the Bible. All they're doing is saying, God, in the same way that Elijah called down fire from heaven, let me call down fire and burn up this village. Lord, in the same way, give me that authority, give me that power, God. There are times when we as Christians today will look into the Bible and go, man, how am I going to respond to this situation? I think I'm going to go over to the Old Testament and I'm going to respond to this situation like Samson. Or this situation like Joshua or Abraham or David. I'm going to slaughter my enemies through the violent power of God. Lord, give me that power. We still today do the same thing that James and John did with Jesus. And every time we ask God to step in with divine acts of judgment and violence against our enemies, Jesus rebukes us. Jesus rebukes us. It is not the full and final picture of God. It is God acting within a certain narrative story to see the success of the land of Israel that would lead to Jesus. It is not the part of the bigger story of God bringing about salvation that will be for all people. That salvation is now made known to us through Jesus Christ. And we are, as we follow Jesus, ambassadors for that good news. And we are to preach and to live out and to enact that good news in the earth. To love people well, even our enemies. To overcome hate with love. To forgive people who have not, will not deserve it or earn it. Of which I fall into that category myself. We are called to forgive those people in the same way that Jesus has shown us. To care for those that are the least of these, the hurting and the oppressed and the poor and the broken. To care for the people in the same way Jesus has modeled for us. This is our task as Christians today. And we are not allowed to just go, let me pick and choose which parts of the Bible I want to go apply for this certain situation. That is where Christians have gotten in trouble and gotten God wrong throughout history. Because we have, sadly, used the Bible to justify war and slavery and subjugation of women and pain and violence and all sorts of things in the name of God, in the name of the Bible. And Jesus rebukes us. We are called to follow Jesus. God can do whatever God wants to do, and he can display his power however he chooses to display it. But ultimately, he would send himself, his son, Jesus Christ, to fully and finally reveal what God is like and what the character of God is like in the big story of bringing about salvation to the world. And that is the story that we get to be a part of today. Amen.